there, fellow classic comic collectors. As always, I'm Scott Harris King, and today I'm going to bring you a new feature here on my YouTube channel, and that is I'm going to start bringing over episodes from my podcast, the Classic Comics Forum podcast. Now, I'm not going to be starting with episode 1, and that's because the first 25 or 26 or however many episodes were recorded audio only. And I am going to eventually bring those onto the YouTube channels. Way back when I hit 50 subscribers, I promised to do that. And what I want to do is add some visual elements so you can have something to look at while we're talking. That's just going to take quite a bit of time to do. But the last couple of the podcasts that I've recorded, we've actually recorded them via Zoom, so I have video of us talking about it. And, sometimes we'll hold up the comics or whatever so you can see what we're talking about. And I think that'll be a little more visually entertaining. So we're going to start off not with the first episode of the Classic Comics Forum podcast. Rather, we're actually going to be starting with episode 27. And this is the first part of a 3-part discussion of the infamous / classic Avengers storyline, the Fall of Yellowjacket, that ran in Avengers numbers 211 to 230. Again, this is 3 parts. Every 2 weeks, I'll bring you the next part of that. And so here we are. I'm joined by a special guest, Icctrombone, who is a big fan of the comic, and we have different perspectives on the comic because I read this storyline as back issues, whereas he read them as they were coming out. So we had very different impressions of the story and the effect on the characters. So I had a lot of fun making this recording. I hope you enjoy it. Since obviously you're familiar with me, but you're not as familiar with Icctrombone, at the beginning of this video, there's going to be a section where I ask him some questions about his comic collecting history, so we get to know him. And then after that, we'll start the discussion. I do have some timestamps down below, so if you want to skip that part and jump ahead, you can do that. There it is. Here we are, episode 27 of the Classic Comics Forum podcast, Avengers, numbers 211 to 230, part 1, with a special guest star Icctrombone. And in this first episode, we discuss issues 211 to 213. There's a lot of stuff to talk about with 213, so we spend a lot of time talking about it in this first episode. Anyone who has read the story knows exactly why. Anyone who hasn't read the story may also still know exactly why, because it's such a famous issue in Avengers history and Marvel history. So here we go, and I hope you enjoy. So what was the first comic you ever read?
I remember my father buying me Superman annual, like an annual. I also remember Fantastic Four, like 102 maybe, but it's hard to say because my older brother's into comic books too, and there was a time where I had the flu and I was home from school, and he brought me like Fantastic Four, the Jack Kirby ones around the 40s. He brought me like the Avengers around the 30s, so it's hard to say, but my early memories are Fantastic Four. That's actually the first comic book that was bought for me, 102. My grandmother bought it off a newsstand for me. I wanted the annual King's Side annual with the Hulk on the cover, but she didn't want to swim for the 25 cents, so she got me the 15-cent one. That's what I remember.
So other than the storyline we just read for this podcast, what was the most recent comic book you read besides that?
I read the whole top 10, Alan Moore.
Yep.
I have it. I actually have it, and I have, I'm like you. I got all these books, my attic and all over around the house. But now that it's digital, I have I have Marvel Unlimited, and I also have Comixology Unlimited. And I saw Comixology had top 10, and I'm like, wow, it's so simple to just kind of like go screen to screen. You end up flying through these comic books, but for this purpose, I read the first few in Marvel Unlimited, and then I went to the actual comic books, holding them, opening them up, and I felt that was more rewarding and a lot more. You get more out of it because you're actually holding it, you're studying it, you're seeing things. Just something on the screen, I don't know. It just doesn't measure up. It's good, it's a time saver and it's a space saver, but I don't think it'll ever measure up for me as far as the real thing, The
I
floppies,
agree.
they call them. They like to call them floppies. I'm not with that term, but okay, whatever.
I agree. I don't like the term floppy. I don't have a better one, but just comic books,
I
just
say comic book, yeah.
yeah. Uh, so in terms of like your favorite comic creators, who's a comic creator that you think is sort of underrated?
Underrated. I like to say Mike Aaron.
Okay.
You know why? Because I tell you, when he started Nexus, right afterwards came up with Badger. In my mind, I said, could this guy be like the next Stan Lee? I mean, these are two big deal concepts that he came up with. I mean, I know they were based on other things that you've seen, but just there's an original way that he approached it. Just Nexus, he has to kill somebody or he'll dream about it until he dies. Just imagine that. You're dreaming, having nightmares. So, okay, I have to get the serial killer or else I'm going to go crazy just dreaming about this. And the other one, Badger, just somebody being like, just a nut. Straight up nut, and he says it in the beginning. Yeah, this guy's crazy, but he's controlled, and it's an interesting take on all that stuff. I know he did a lot of Punisher, and he's famous for that in other books. And I just absolutely love his Flash run. The second Flash of Wally West, the first
Mhm.
issues, I reread those like almost every year. I just love that because he brought a freshness and a way of writing that character that no one else did. He made him a guy that likes to like have sex with everybody, and it's just like irresponsible guy. And it was just, again, it rang true. It's like a young guy. What would he be doing? He would be going chasing tail. And it was interesting. And he was he had a lot of experience, but he was making errors along the way, and just it was engaging the way he wrote that book. Too bad he ran out of ideas after the 18th issue or whatever they left. But
Yeah. That's about when I stopped, like, because I started reading that Flash run with number one. I hadn't read the Barry Allen series, so I got in with number one, and I stopped buying it right around when he left. I think 19 or 20 was my last issue. It just
yeah, I have the whole run. I mean, pretty much the whole run. Pretty much the whole run. But I mean, to me, those are the ones because I mean, just the idea. I mean, it was just I reread it all the time, and every time I read it, it gets a little better. But anyway,
yeah. So who's a comic creator you think is overrated?
wow. I look at the guys that are really good, and I say, they're not overrated. Like, people like Alan Moore, no, he's not overrated. To me, Jim Starlin is one of my favorite guys. He's not overrated. That's a tough question. You should have gave me the questions ahead of
I
time.
should have. I should have. I meant to do that. I actually forgot to write them down myself until just before you called. I was like, oh, the questions.
I mean, it's hard to say. The new guys now, I don't really follow, so I don't know who's overrated. I know they kill somebody, Hickman. Those guys, they kind of like are hard on them. But the old guys, I mean, they all did their thing. I'm trying to think. I'm drawing a blank.
That's
I
all right.
love them all.
Well, since you don't have an answer, I'll just say John Byrne, and we can move on to the next.
Yeah, John Byrne. Oh, wow. Hey, that guy was on top of the world.
He was a
So,
great artist. I just don't like anything he started. Once his head got too big in his writing. Anyway, this
yeah,
isn't about me. This is about what you like. So,
I think Byrne was good. I think Byrne was, again, the top guy. But, I mean, nothing lasts forever.
who's your favorite character in comics?
Well, I mean, the easy answer is Thor, because he's all over the place in my posts and the recent buys have been buying Thor. But I got to tell you, I do like Hawkeye a lot, at least till he became a member of the Thunderbolts. I thought he was just a great character because he'll tell you off. He'll just. I mean, I like the frankness and the brashness, and that never really left him. That's part of his character. Again, the guy that you see nowadays, I don't read that much of it. I see it. They made him a womanizer and whatever. I like him, and of course, Superman, because he does things, because it's the right thing to do. The Boy Scout, but I like Boy Scouts. They're okay.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Thor. Well, my first Marvel was Thor. It was during the Walt Simonson run. So, I love Thor. and I love Hawkeye.
Robinson, you're a youngin', man.
Yeah. My first issue was either 350 or 351. I'm not sure which, but
Yeah.
So who's your least favorite character? Who's a character that you just don't like? You just don't like reading about this character?
Well, Deadpool's kind of stupid. All the popular ones kind of dumb. I'm trying to think of a high-profile guy. Oh yeah, Green Lantern, Hal Jordan. He's so boring. I know the Barry Allen that used to be was really boring too. I read some things with him recently. I mean, again, it's not kind of like not the same character. It's like a whole different, just invent things and throw it on there. So, I mean, I would say, there's a lot of characters I hate that don't headline their own books, but those kind of jump to mind. A lot of DC characters, unfortunately, were kind of bland. They had interchangeable personalities. So, I mean, I did like them during the Neil Adams stuff, but it was mostly because of Neil Adams,
Yeah. If you were stranded on a desert island, what comic would you want to bring with you? Whether it's a single story or like a whole run, like what's the one comic you would bring with you to a desert island?
Wow. That's tough. If it was single run, there's so many runs that I wouldn't want to part with. I'd go with Avengers. I'd go with the Avengers run, the first 300, let's say. So after that, it's really not much to say. It's more, and I do really like Hitman too. That really is a great series. Have you ever read that?
No, I'm not a big fan of Ennis.
Yeah, it's hilarious, man. That book was just, and it ends too. I mean, how many books you see, beginning, middle, end? That really doesn't happen. People kept getting reincarnated. I still haven't seen him yet. So, but yeah, that's pretty good too. I like my Fantastic Fours as well. But Avengers, like, I got a soft spot with me, especially stories that involve the top, the first five, the original five,
Yeah.
Every time they put an incarnation of them, I always see are the five there, I kind of look and see, okay, yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah, makes it a little more special for me.
Okay, all right. Last question here. If you could have one dream comic, like you could have any character or title that's done by any creative team, living or dead, so you get to just pluck them out of time and have them do the book that you want to see, what book would you sort of create?
Man, I like to cheat and just say Alan Moore doing anything, being drawn by, I don't know, Jim Starlin or Neil Adams. Those are. I mean, you can't go wrong with them. I don't like when Neil Adams writes his own stuff. I think a lot of guys fail with that. But you combine it with somebody like Alan Moore. I kind of never seen Alan Moore miss. Guy does stuff that's just wow. Blows your mind. Even if it's a rehash of things, he puts a little twist on it that you go, oh wow.
Yeah. Okay. I appreciate Alan Moore. He's not my favorite, but he's very good. He's very good.
What's your team? What's the comic you would want to put together?
Well, so I mean, the comic that I would want to do is this character Crime Buster that I'm a big fan of from the 40s.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I would want to have that written by Ed Brubaker and drawn by Darwin Cook. That's what I would really like. Sort of like
that's interesting. Crime Buster. I haven't read not one book with Crime Buster. I mean, that's a 50s book, right?
Yeah, I mean they're hit or miss. I've recommended to a couple people, and then they buy they're like, hey, I got these, and I was like, oh no, those issues are not the good ones.
Put by the hand and say, okay, no, read this one, don't read that one.
Yeah. All right, so I was really interested when you said that Hank Pym was one of your favorite characters, because I've never heard anyone say that. So I'm just going to set the stage for what was going on before we started this run with the infamous Trial of Yellowjacket, or the Fall of Yellowjacket, however you want to call it. Ran from Avengers 211 to 230, and I just reread the whole thing last night. Basically, I've read the storyline probably 6 or 7 times in its entirety before, but I wanted to, look at it with a close eye, and I think in my opinion, this is maybe the best written Avengers storyline. The writing in here, the character stuff, it's so good. Um, so Avengers has a long history where they had a lot of really good writers who had long runs on it. So there's a lot of consistency. You know, over the first 200 issues, there was only 6 regular writers. But after issue 200, there was a little period there for almost a year where it really started getting uneven for the first time ever. Some of those issues, like 205, 206, like we started getting some fill-ins and some weird stuff. And so Jim Shooter, who was editor-in-chief and had previously written Avengers during the Korvac saga, he decided to take the book over himself. And it's interesting, he decided to plan his whole run around Hank Pym. I read some interviews with Jim Shooter. He's got a blog that he does, and he posted some stuff about this storyline where he said that before he went into it, he reread all the appearances of the characters, and he decided that he could sort of see Hank Pym as a guy who is sort of had some self-esteem issues and some mental health issues and was always felt like he didn't live up to things. This was Shooter's take on rereading these old stories.
It was his take.
Yeah.
I object. I'm keep holding my tongue until you finish.
Well, I want to hear what you have to say, because he decided that was his viewpoint, and I think it's a valid viewpoint, but as we'll talk about in a minute, I think Shooter made one serious error at the beginning of this storyline. But he planned this arc where he was going to tear down Hank Pym and have him lose everything, including Jan. It was all part of the plan. According to Shooter, it was part of the plan from the beginning, although Jim Shooter is notorious for having telling these stories that nobody else thinks are true. But according to Jim Shooter, he planned this from the start, and then he was going to then build Hank Pym back up, and he was going to emerge as a better hero than ever and sort of have this big redemption arc. And that sort of happened, but I don't think it happened quite the way that Jim Shooter expected it to. I'm really curious to hear your feelings. I guess we can wait until we get to 213 in particular, but just to set the stage, I started reading Avengers issue 256. So this was the recent past for me. My first introduction to Hank Pym was in West Coast Avengers #1, not the limited series, but the regular series. And at that point, we get this overview of the stuff that happens in this storyline, because it's really the first time that the readers have seen Hank Pym since the end of this. And so for me, this is just who Hank Pym was, because this is literally my introduction, is Hank Pym in West Coast Avengers 1 talking about his guilt and shame about this storyline. And so I know a lot of the older readers who were were familiar with the character before this arc. This was like a huge, shocking, like, change of character, but I'd never experienced that, because for me, this was the character that I was introduced to. So what was it like reading these at the time when we get this like shakeup here?
Wow, it's interesting that you say you started reading him around West Coast of Avengers, because, he was such kind of a loser there. I mean, he was going to shoot himself. I mean, I was like, come on. I know a lot went down, but I mean, this is the thing with comic books that you don't own. Like, if you're a creator, no one could go and turn Hank Pym into like this loser if you don't want him to. I mean, you're the writer. You're the one that determines this is what he is and this is what happens to him. Now, Engelhardt comes along, or Jim Shooter comes along and says, oh, well, all the stuff that he ever did for the first 40 years of his existence, he was just had low self-esteem. And I'm sorry, I don't get that. I don't get that at all. Matter of fact, I was reading some of his. I mean, I read his Ant-Man on, like the beginning where that throwaway story where on Tales of Astonishing 27, where he's just like this nameless, faceless scientist who shrinks down, and then and has these adventures, and at the end goes, oh, I'm gonna throw this formula away because whatever. I mean, it was a monster book at that point. So they bring it back in Tales of Astonishing 35 with a costume and everything, because you okay there?
Yeah, just beverage went down the wrong pipe. Sorry, keep going.
Okay, I thought it was something I said. But yeah, they bring him back in 35, and he's this costume guy because I guess at that point Marvel's moving along with costume guys and they want to start their own universe. And he's capable, man. You know, he invented all these things. He's fighting crime. The police are going to him. You know, he's kind of this respectable character. Now, again, this how it happens. You know, he's going along, and then the first time you actually see him where he's like not in charge of something, some tragedy, is Tales to Astonish 44. That's the one where they introduce the storyline that he was married previously. They went to vacation behind the Iron Curtain, as they say, and she was killed. No real reason, but oh, she was killed. You can't leave us, comrade, and whatever. So they never get solved. The woman's missing. They find the body, and then he goes to America, and he's like destroyed. But you know, that's some backstory that didn't exist. But anyway, they use that to introduce Jan into the situation, and then you know she becomes a partner after her father's killed by some creature from another dimension, and he helps to solve it. But to that point, you know, he's this capable guy, man. You know, not only did he invent the shrinking formula, he invents like better powers for the wasp than he has. I mean, she grows wings. She has everything, you know, that he doesn't have. But you know, I mean, he's a capable guy. Now I'm jumping further ahead to the Avengers books, and I was leafing through one of these essential books because you know I don't want to pull my books out. I'm leafing through it, and I'm seeing like every appearance he had as Giant Man, not everyone, but just early ones as Giant Man, and he's a capable guy, man. You know, he's one of the. In other words, of course, Thor's powerhouse, Iron Man's a powerhouse. I mean, he's number 3. You know, he's there. Like I read what Jim Shooter said, and he sort of was saying, well, he had low self-esteem because he was compared to the other two and he never measured up. And I'm like, well, that's your interpretation of it. But he was always, like when he ever came into a fight, he was holding his own and he was tackling 10 guys at a time. It wasn't like he was too exhausted after fighting. That's an interpretation that he chose to throw on the character after the fact. You know, I'll buy that, you know, later on when he has these mental issues as far as mind control and whatever, you know, that's a comic book thing, you know, where you have your mind control and you're okay the next issue or whatever. But you know, okay, you could say tampering with his mind, that began to, you know, that did something. I'll go with that. But as far as low self-esteem, I don't see it. Matter of fact, I was looking through the essential. And there's one story called This Hostage Earth. And at the beginning of the story is that he gets alerted by ants that there's something happening on the earth. Like they're scattering around and they contact him. And he calls the Avengers to meet in a meeting, an emergency meeting. And they're like, what happened? And he's like, yeah, these ants told me there's something happening. And Iron Man goes, come on, everybody's a comedian. Come on, what did you really call us for? And he says, look, I'm not kidding. The ants told me that there's something happening in the middle of the earth and we have to respond. And Thor like gets so pissed off. He goes, you have the temerity to bring us here about some ants? He goes, I don't know whether to be mad or to laugh. And he kind of gets him pissed off to the point where Pym says, you know what? You guys could take off, man. I was doing okay before you guys showed up, and I could do okay without you. Everybody, get out of here. And he throws them out. And then he tackles the situation himself. And then later on, of course, when he can't beat the Mole Man by himself, the Avengers look at it and go, "Oh my God, he was right." And they all feel guilt ridden, and they go help him, whatever, and everything's solved. But the idea that he could tell Thor and Iron Man, "I was doing okay without you, and you could hit the road," that's not low self-esteem to me.
Yeah.
You know. But you know, I mean, look, every rider comes along. There's a fork in the road. You could take it to the right, or you could take it to the left. You know, I mean, to deconstruct these characters, you know, that's where the drama is anyway. You know, you give somebody a problem, and now what do they do? Take everything away from them. Now what? You know, so that's where the drama is anyway. Well, I mean, but it hurt me because I love them, you know, and this is one of my favorite characters, and you're making them like, one, you know, like he made a mistake that led to the court martial. It wasn't like he was malicious about it.
Well, let's go over those issues here for those who listening who don't know yet what we're talking about. I'll just go over 211 real quick. There's a couple things in 211 that I think are interesting. The Shooter's first issue is writer, and he does it as a sort of a classic Avengers time for a new lineup, because every once in a while they'll have the old order changeth, and In this issue, yeah, I love it too.
As a matter of fact, this was my favorite one of all of them. All the changes ones, this is the one.
Yeah, I like it quite a bit too. And basically what happens is every superhero in the tri-state area shows up at Avengers Mansion to try out, and the Avengers are like, why are you all here? And then it turns out that Moondragon has been mentally controlling everyone because she says that she thinks the Avengers need a new lineup. And so she's sent all these people there to try out. And what ends up happening is Shooter dumps all of these Avengers that have been in the book for years and years, and for like 15 years in some cases. Vision, the Scarlet Witch, Beast, Wonder Man had all been in the book for years, all just chucked out the window. And what he does is he brings back basically the original team.
I love it.
Without the Hulk, which is fine with me because I don't really consider the Hulk to be Avenger. So we've got the original team of Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, Wasp, and Hank Pym in his Yellowjacket identity. And then he adds in Tigra, which we'll talk about in a minute. And that's basically the issue.
I hated her. Anyway, go ahead. Or maybe I was supposed to hate her anyway. That's good, right?
Well, I think we were. Shooter said in the letter column at the time that the point of putting Tigra in the book was to show that not everybody is cut out to be an Avenger. And I appreciate that as a writer. Like it's a thing. We're going to see him do this a lot in the story, where a writer has this thing where you create characters or situations that are basically mirrors of the main character so you can see them from different angles. And in this sense, Tigra not being cut out to be an Avenger is sort of a mirror of what Hank Pym is experiencing. It's from a different perspective. But the other thing, way that they mirror each other sort of unintentionally, I think, is that Tigra, in this few issues she's in, she acts like this flirty, flighty, sort of brainless, like, idiot who's basically like, he treats her like she's half human and half like kitty cat. In all of her previous appearances, she was like half tiger. And so she was much more fierce and independent. If you read the character of Greer Nelson in The Cat #1, her first appearance, and then compare that character to the way Shooter writes Tigra in here, it's not even close to the same character. He basically chucks out all of her established character traits because he has a plot that he wants to put her into. And I think he does kind of the same thing in a way with Hank Pym as well. Go ahead.
As far as Tigra, I don't know anything about the character. I know that the way she was written, the flirty stuff, I didn't have a problem with that, but I did have a problem with a person just walking in and kind of telling, oh yeah, this Hank Pym's a loser. Why are you with him and this and that? So I'm like, you haven't, you can't even like unbuckle his bootstraps to what he's done in his whole career. Kind of makes me think about you. You said you only know him from West Coast Avengers on. I'm like, but you don't know all the stuff and the heroic stuff he did up to that point. That's what makes his fall and this stripping of everything like terrible. Because this guy was really like one of the top heroes in the Avengers and throughout the history. So for him to take everything taken away, it was kind of like it hurt, And as a matter of fact, Jim Shooter said he got a lot of hate mail as far as, how could you do this and that? And he got a little worried. He said he went to Stan Lee, and Stan Lee was like, that's great. That's the best. I mean, people care about the character. They're following it. As a matter of fact, they did get a sales bump because of all this,
Yeah, I read that too. I read those comments too. And what's interesting is when we get to the issue where they actually publish the letters about 213, which we haven't yet talked about, but the issue with the court-martial, all the letters they published were resoundingly positive, talking about how great the issue was. And I was reading that letter column going, what? I know that's not what people actually thought. They clearly just didn't publish any of the bad letters.
I mean, they control what you're going to read ultimately, But just before we get off to 11, I want to say a couple of things about that issue that maybe it was just the best recruitment issue. And also Gene Colan did a nice job. Too bad Gene Colan, Shooter didn't like him. He didn't get along with Gene Colan for whatever reason, But I thought, Shooter's opinion was that he was phoning it in at that point, and he wasn't really trying. And I'm like, maybe it was just a conflict thing. Look, I'm a big Shooter fan, but I also know that it's your opinion, your interpretation. But Colin did a nice job in that book. I just want to point out a couple of things that I really enjoyed. I like the idea that all these guys are coming in that they're being made to fight, which is a Marvel thing. Whoever will show up, oh, let's fight. But this actually had a reason. She was pushing them to like audition so they could see what they could do. And Hawkeye is one of the people brought in, and I love the line he gives. She goes, when she's finally discovered, she says, yeah, well, you could leave because I don't think, your time is right for you to be here now. And he goes, hey, if you're so hot, how come you had to bring me all the way over here now to discover that? You could have just left me where I was. I was just like, That's Hawkeye, I love him. And there's another part of the issue which starts something where Hercules, they're all talking, and at one point, Wonder Man says something. I think about Tigra, and he says, Hercules is like, what are you talking about? She did a lot more than you did. What's your power? I just saw you standing around. And he says, well, he tells her, well, I have the power like sort of like Thor, And he says, you do? And he says, then I'm gonna give you a gift. And he punches him and starts fighting with the guy. And the gift was something used by Bob Layton later on in the Hercules miniseries. He's like his fighting a guy is his way of giving him a gift.
Yeah,
so I like the way that came out of there. But the issue is great, and like you alluded to something earlier, that there's a throwaway line he says at the end there. Hank Pym, he says, "Well, my lab work wasn't going anywhere anyway.
Yeah,
so I might as well join the Avengers." So you can see there's something happening there. That's like a foreshadowing of stuff, because he's kind of quiet in that whole issue. I mean, I think he's the one that figures out Moondragon might be behind it, and she freezes his mind or whatever. But I just love seeing the five there assembled. I was like, hey, this is great. I mean, I remember there was a point there that I think Stan Lee, early in the Avengers run, didn't want the big three in the book. He says because it messed up continuity in their own books. And Roy Thomas would always try to sneak them in, the big three, to be in the Avengers book. But if you notice, from a certain point on, they're never there. It's always Vision, Black Panther, or whoever. And they try to keep the people that they don't have their own titles, separate. And, just to see these guys all in the same book, it was wonderful. And, throughout this whole run from 211 to 220, 230, Thor, Captain America, and Iron Man are there the whole pretty much the whole time. I mean, Iron Man bows at the end for another reason we'll talk about later. But the point is, I like the idea that he kept them there,
Yeah, I agree.
They're a big draw to the book.
Yeah. Couple of things real quick. One thing that's interesting about this, because we're going to see this as a recurring sort of theme throughout the storyline, is Moondragon is mentally manipulating everybody. We're going to see her come back in several issues and do this again. And it's not just her. We get Egghead does this a few times. People throughout this storyline are being mind controlled and mentally manipulated to the point where there's some discussion among the team members in several issues about whether any of them actually have control over their own thoughts and actions, or whether they can even know if they ever have control over thoughts and actions. And I think he's planting that right here.
It's pretty awesome, that he had to throw that in, because they're just saying, well, we can't trust anything. Can we trust anything we've been doing? We don't know, But I mean, I don't think they find any evidence of it, but it just makes you kind of paranoid. You're like, well, what really is this all Moondragon's doing from the beginning? We don't know.
Yeah.
It is an interesting theme that does come back. You're right.
And the other thing, the Gene Colan doing this issue and then leaving is going to be, I think, important when we get to 213. I have a bunch of things to say about 213, but actually I want to talk about 212 first, because of course it sets up 213, but I've read 212 again half a dozen times at least. But when I read it this time, looking at it critically as part of this run, I thought it was much more interesting and more important than I had realized. So just to give the plot for the people that haven't read it, basically, there's this woman who's called Elf Queen in the story, and she's got this guy who's basically like Conan, and they're lovers, and she's cast a spell so that they're in this idyllic like little valley separated from the rest of the world, and they've been living there for 10,000 years in peace and harmony. And in this story, he is feeling very restless, and he's kind of tired of this. He wants to go back to civilization. So against her wishes, he sort of drags her back to civilization, and there's complete culture shock, as you might expect. There's a bunch of misunderstandings happen, and he ends up getting in fights, and she's trying to diffuse things. And so she, at one point, has to save him, and he gets angry, and he hits her, and she leaves, and then he becomes sort of despondent. He gets in this fight, and the police accidentally kill him.
Mm.
And when I was reading this, I realized everything that happens with those characters is a foreshadowing of the same plot that's about to happen with Hank Pym and Jan. It's all the same, mentally the same reasons. Like he feels emasculated because she's more powerful and she saves him, and so he ends up hitting her. Everything that they do in here we see in the next issue with Hank and Jan, and I never noticed that until I read this last night.
Yeah, when you read it a couple of times, it kind of jumps out at you. Even the point where he smacks her, like there's a point where I think he hits her or something like that, and she leaves angry and stay here if you want, whatever, But yeah, there's a lot coming there, and I mean, yeah. So I got some things to say about that issue too, but
yeah, the other thing I want to say though is like, as you mentioned, there's one line in 211 where Hank's like, well, my research wasn't going very well, but Hank only gets like 2 sentences in issue 211. So when we get to 212 here, we jump straight into, all of a sudden, Hank, who has barely been seen in comics for a couple years real time. Last time we saw him, he was like, yep, I'm having fun in my laboratory. You do your thing, Jan, and I'll just do here. And now when we see him here, he's just like this raging asshole right from the first page.
Yeah.
And this is where I think Shooter made... I think this is a great storyline with some great writing, but I think his big mistake was there wasn't nearly enough setup, because we didn't see Hank in those years struggling in his laboratory. We don't have any context. All we know is he's always been cool, and then all of a sudden he's a total asshole. And I think it's really jarring. If he had spent like 6 issues where we see Hank slowly turn into an asshole as he's struggling, instead of having it happen in like 3 pages, I think everything that happened afterwards would have been much easier to understand. It's really jarring. Now I've reread, of course, I've read all the Avengers issues now. I hadn't at the time, when I first encountered this. This is one of the first back issue stories I read, so I still didn't actually have read any of his real appearances. But now that I've read all of the previous issues of Avengers, it's really jarring how he goes from just like, last time we see him a couple years ago, he's like, Jan, you enjoy your superheroing, I'm gonna just go into my laboratory, and now he's just like, ah.
Yeah, that's what got me, because you said you went back and read them, but I read them as they were coming out. And this guy was, to me, was one of the top 5. He was right there with the original Avengers. He didn't have to bow to anybody. Of course, Thor and Iron Man were the big shots, but he was integral also to what was happening, and he was capable. Again, he could handle things himself. He was like, I've been doing it by myself before. So now all of a sudden, he's this guy that he can't do anything right, and he's mad at the world, and he's mad at her. He resents her. You're right. It was jarring, and it was. I mean, if you want to throw in that, okay, he's having a mental breakdown or whatever, I don't know. It does come on kind of sudden, but then again, there was something happening, and Shooter's trying to say, well, this was always happening. We just weren't watching it. He was always in the lab flipping out and breaking things and whatever, and we just didn't see it. This is, I mean, that's what they allude to in the following issues, that there was stuff happening there, but it just kind of came out in the wrong way. And I guess the more Jan tried to comfort him, the more he got angry,
Yeah. So at the end of this issue, he's trying to prove himself. His weapons are short-circuiting, and Captain America basically diffuses the situation. And then Hank's trying to play hero, and he shoots the Elf Queen in the back and almost kills her. And then she almost kills everybody. And so at the end, he looks like a complete jerk. That's where the story ends. What did you think? I know you said you had some more things to say about this one.
Well, this is the problem. I'm looking at my notes. I put down the artists and all the people that were involved in here. This issue was drawn by Alan Cooperberg. I don't really know him from anything. I think I've seen him do fill-in issues, whatever. And this is not a guy that should have been. They should have put a better artist so you could see the facial expressions, because they had some scenes, they had some panels where Hank Pym just looks maniacal. I mean, he has this twisted look on his face. I'm like, hey, you know, he's having his problems, but he's not this evil guy, and you're showing him like an evil guy, and just it was crazy. Like, you know, again, there's a point in that book where, like, I think you said Wasp saves him, and he's mad that she saved him. Like, how could you? How come it had to be you? I'm like, this is crazy. You know, this is kind of like, she just saved you. What are you talking about? You know, I guess they're trying to show the breakdown and his resentment, but yeah, like you said, it's jarring, and the artwork wasn't really. I thought it wasn't professional caliber. It was kind of, you know, which I'm going to make a comment about in the following issues with Bob.
Yeah, I have a whole bunch to say about the art because I think it's really important for next issue. So let's. I feel like we're going to be talking about this issue for a while. The 213, one of the most infamous comics that Marvel ever published.
Yep.
And I'm just going to set the stage again for people who haven't read it. Basically, what happens is Captain America decides to bring Yellowjacket up for an official Avengers court-martial based on what Yellowjacket did in the last issue, and Yellowjacket just goes completely off the deep end. And Hank, he comes up with this like insane plan where he builds this giant adamantium robot, and the idea is if the court martial goes badly, which of course it does, because he's, you know, acting like a total asshole.
It goes badly because it's his entire fault that it goes badly.
Yes,
but you know,
he builds this robot, and he's like, the robots. I'm gonna summon the robot, and it'll trash the Avengers, and then I'll save them because I've put this failsafe in on the robot, and then it'll make me look like the hero, and everything will be saved. And Jan finds out about this partway through, and she tries to talk him out of it, and he just belts her in the face and knocks her across the room with this like right cross. And then so they go to the thing, the hearing goes badly, and the Avengers find out that he hit Jan because she's got a giant black eye, and he summons the robot, but he can't actually deactivate it because he gets clobbered before he has a chance to. Luckily, the Wasp knows where the off switch is, and she stops the robot, and he's left in disgrace. And it's one of the most infamous comics Marvel's ever published. It's the issue that is forever branded Hank as the wife beater. And there's just so much to talk about here. But before I get into my pages and pages and pages of notes on this, I just wanted to ask what you think of it and what you thought of it at the time.
Well, okay, this is. I mean, I read a couple interviews, one from Shooter and one from Bob Hall. Jim Shooter said, again, I read the blog that you alluded to, and he did say, you know, the article, the name of the article was Hank is not a wife beater, right? His take is that he originally he wasn't supposed to hit her like that. She was supposed to be around him. He was supposed to get up suddenly, and his suddenly getting up pushes her back, and she hits the face or whatever. Now, somewhere between that and the instructions to Bob Hall, something other happened. Bob Hall, it wasn't a right cross, it was a backhand. But so she, you know, he hits her backhand, whatever. And Bob Hall says, look, and I appreciate his honesty. He says, look, man, I was pretty much a fan of, not even a professional at the time. I could barely hold the pencil, and you know, I didn't know what to do with the scarf, so I just put that in there, and that was it. He says, you know, maybe I messed up by putting that, but you know, and I'm like, well, that was major. Except that I don't know. I don't know if it, like you said, sometimes Shooter says things and you don't know if it's true. But he, you know, I don't know how. I mean, that panel could be redrawn. You know what I'm saying? Like something else could happen. Plus, I mean, the dialogue later on shows that he hit her. So I don't know if he just wrote the dialogue to fit the picture that was already there, or what. But you know, Bob Hall does say, "Look, I could barely hold the pencil, and I was really more like a fan, you know, not even professional at the time. So that's what happened." But you know.
Sorry, Shooter did write the dialogue to fit the artwork, and he uses that as an excuse for this happening, because he said that because he was so busy as the editor-in-chief, he had to work the classic Marvel method where he'd just give them the plot and they would give him all the completed artwork and then he'd put the dialogue on it. And he said by the time he got this issue, it was so late that they didn't have time to redraw it and they had to go to publisher. He had to just work with what was on the page. Now, I find this to be a terrible excuse, because if he really thought that there was a real problem with the way this was drawn, given the sensitivity of the subject matter, I think would be obligated to just put it off for 1 week. And if they lose $5,000 or whatever the cost was for delaying the printing, then they lose the money. But I think it's really weak for him to sort of blame, to say, well, we couldn't change it. They could have changed it. He's the editor-in-chief. He could have done whatever he wanted.
I'm wondering if, I mean, look, he's the big shot editor-in-chief. They got artists walking around all over the place. All he had to do is pull somebody in, okay, redraw this panel. And pull somebody else in, okay, ink that panel. Okay, we're done. Let's go.
Yeah,
so,
he claims that Bill Sienkiewicz came into his office when he saw the published issue and yelled at him for not allowing Bill to redraw the panel. But here's the thing that I think is like...
I'm sorry, I heard that too. What was that about? What, Sienkiewicz was a domestic violence survivor or something?
I don't know. Shooter paints it that Sienkiewicz could tell from the script, from reading it somehow, that Bob Hall had drawn it incorrectly, and that Sienkiewicz realized that he could have drawn it correctly. But for me, I think the big what if here doesn't have anything to do with Bill Sienkiewicz. It has to do with Gene Colan, because Bob Hall's whole thing is that he's a new artist. He's not skilled enough. He said that he redrew that panel several times and just couldn't get the nuance that he needed, so he had to go like full action. And to me, it's a big what if Jim Shooter hadn't gotten in such a big feud with Gene Colan that Colan quit Marvel completely after Avengers 211. Because if you have Gene Colan drawing this issue, that's a guy who nuance is his whole art style. And he could have, if Shooter actually intended this to be drawn differently, Gene Colan could have drawn this as subtly as anybody in comics could have done.
Top pro, Gene Colan, for sure. I mean, yeah. Everything I read is that he didn't like Gene Colan. And even his wife, and there's horror stories that he would keep asking Gene Colan to redraw things, and the whole page is, this is no good, do it again. And there was a point where I think Gene Colan's wife said that, well, you know, he asked us to redraw it. We didn't redraw it. We submitted the same thing, and he said it was okay. So
yes, I've heard that story too.
Going around with him. I don't know why, but you know, hey, look, this is the real world we live in. Sometimes you don't like somebody, and you take it on them because you have power over them. I don't know.
So I think like this shows like one of the big problems with the Marvel method of writing, which is that it allows things like this to happen. It's interesting to think about what Shooter would have written in future issues if this hadn't have happened the way it happened, because I think the way that this ends up taking place, where it's such a violent act, an intentional violent act, that he was required in the later issues to treat it very seriously in a way that maybe he wouldn't have had to do otherwise. To me, it reminds me of what happened with the death of Jean Grey, where they had put some stuff, the artist had drawn in her blowing up this planet that wasn't in the script, and then when Jim Shooter saw it, he said there has to be ramifications. You have to kill her off because we can't have someone committing genocide. I feel like this is the same thing. He gets the artwork in, and all of a sudden he's like, oh crap, I've got to write this in a certain way from this point forward, because we put this in here, it has to be treated as seriously as we showed it to be.
Well, you know, that could be, because there's several instances in that issue of kind of like abuse. Not before he smacks her, before he backhands her, she comes in the lab as wasp size, and he sees that she's there, and he tries to stomp her with his hand. He tries to smash her with his hand and misses. So that's one. And later on, when he smacks her, and she goes, "Oh, this is crazy plan," whatever, she's on the floor, he goes, "Well, you better go along or else." So I'm like, yikes.
Yeah.
It's not just one isolated thing. He's going to beat her up if she doesn't go along with this. Well, she kind of does. I mean, you know, I get you in a tough spot. You know, she goes to that meeting with dark glasses on, and she says, "This is crazy," you know. But You know, I mean,
So
yeah, I guess he wrote the dialogue the way it is, but again, maybe the story. You know, I'm just wondering. You take out the hitting part, so what really happens? She doesn't get divorced. You know, there's other things that don't happen. So I don't know if I buy that, but you know, it's the way it developed. So that's what
I
made the story.
agree. I don't entirely buy Shooter's claim that he didn't intend it to be like this, because he says in that same blog post that he intended Jan to leave him. That was the original plan, is that they were gonna like separate at least. So for him to say that he didn't intend this, it's the entire reason in the story that was published that she left him. So I part of me thinks that Shooter is doing one of his revisionist histories
That's a
thing.
good point. Why else would she leave him? She wouldn't leave him if he got arrested. That's her husband. She's gonna stick with him. So he had to do something that in her mind was unforgivable. You know, and it can't be that he's going crazy because she's helped him, you know, through some of his mental issues before. So maybe he's fibbing a little bit there with not hitting. But man, you know, he could have just said, "Yeah, I wanted him to hit her," and that's it. Why do you have to lie about it? You know?
So it's obviously we're going to talk about the rest of the arc, but one thing that's interesting here is Shooter says that the whole plan was to tear down Hank Pym and then rebuild him up as this big hero. And when you read this storyline, he does have the redemption arc, but the character has really never recovered in some ways from this issue. And I think it's more because he gets this reputation in comic fandom as a domestic abuser. Most of those people have never read the storyline, so they don't read how it actually plays out. They don't read the redemption arc. They haven't read his later stories in West Coast Avengers. And so I know Tom Brevoort, the current editor of Avengers, has said that he's tried over his many years of Avengers. They've had several writers that have tried to do these stories where they rehabilitate Hank as a character, and the fans just won't. Basically, they won't accept it because he has such a bad reputation as a result of this issue. And so I find it interesting on several levels. First of all, that Shooter was trying to, according to him, he had a plan to sort of make Hank into a bigger, better hero than ever before. And that completely backfired if that was his plan. But also, it's interesting to think about the popularity of the character sort of dictating the stories. We see that a lot with characters like Wolverine. But in this instance, we've seen other characters at Marvel that have been involved in domestic abuse. There's an infamous issue, and I don't even know what issue it was because I forgot to look it up, but there's an issue where Peter Parker as Spider-Man loses his temper and hits Mary Jane in the face. And yet Spider-Man's popular, so everyone just is like, let's just forget that ever happened. But Hank Pym is not nearly as popular, and so he's like permanently labeled as a domestic abuser, and which I think is fair to a degree, but it's just an interesting how the fans they'll overlook things if they like the character, and they won't overlook it if they don't like the character.
Yeah, I heard it. Yeah, I've heard it compared a lot to the Spider-Man thing. I saw it. He said he punches her with a closed fist, you know, the right cross, I should say. You know, I mean, I don't know why. I mean, it could be because Hank is not like the top tier character. Maybe that's why. Yeah, it did damage the character. I don't really like what happened afterwards either. It seems like even to this day they don't really know what to do with him. I know that what's his name? The guy that Disaster City, the writer.
Kurt Busiek?
Yeah. He tried to fix him, you know, when he did his run with Perez. In fact, he made him back into a Giant Man or Goliath, and he was, you know, a big shot hero there too. And they even had an annual that tried to psychoanalyze the whole thing, you know, and you know, but I mean, it just didn't work, you know. Like you said, somebody always go back to it, you know. So yeah. Peter, you know, he did this before. You can't erase it, you know.
Yeah. I've got some more comments about that storyline, but I'm going to save that for the very end. One last thing about this, just in terms of Shooter's plan to sort of do all this character work with Hank to sort of build him back up. Again, that does sort of happen, but what actually ends up happening that's much more successful and kind of problematic for me in a way is that as an immediate result of this, in the next issues, we're going to see a whole bunch of really interesting character development with Jan. And I think Jan actually had never really been taken seriously as a character until this. And then we see in the next few issues, we're going to talk about this in just a second, where she becomes the leader of the Avengers. She builds this whole life. She gains this sort of new, I don't want to say confidence, but she becomes an independent person and sort of becomes a more important character than Hank. But if you look at her character history, most writers just treat her as like, she's the flirty, rich heiress airhead. She's like Kim Kardashian, but with superpowers.
Mm.
And then, but as a result of this, she's treated much more seriously after this point by future writers. And so the thing that bothers me a little bit about that is that she should have been able to have all of that development without needing to have this domestic abuse story sort of kickstart it. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? Maybe I'm just like...
I just think that the era of the 80s is when women began to be less than hostages, so I could see, she kind of like forced them into making her the chairman, because she's like, I nominate myself. And they're like, what? They're like caught by surprise. It's like, yeah, you're gonna second it? Yeah, it kind of forces them. But
yeah.
She grows into it, and a pretty good leader. And matter of fact, she is thought of as one of the better leaders Avengers ever had. Captain America, her, I think there's a few other people that have been in charge, but she's the one to keep going back to. So she is good there. I don't know if it had to do with the domestic stuff, but it just seemed that there came a point with him, and also Claremont was doing that in the X-Men books, where he's making women a little more, not the background characters anymore. So I didn't really see that as an offshoot, but it was interesting in this sense that now she's doing that to overcome and be busy. So she has to think about the tragedy of a marriage. She was married to this guy and loved him. It wasn't make believe. And anytime there's a divorce or something happens of that nature, you want to move on and cover it and deny it, and not, you don't want to face it. So her taking that job was her way of pushing her feelings down. And you see that in issues that follow, where there's a version where she's ready to cry, and she says, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to hold myself together and whatever. So, because this is a terrible event, not just that, but what happens afterwards, next couple of days, so I can see somebody keeping busy. Look, man, my father passed away a couple of weeks ago, and I just want to keep busy. I don't really want to think about it. So that rings true.